Moderating today's panel is Camille Carlton, who is the Senior Policy Manager at the Center for Humane Technology, where she steers the organization's policy strategy, helping align policy initiatives with the public interest. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Maureen, Mary, Lee, the other storytellers for sharing these deeply personal and important stories, for giving us a grounding for how real and impactful the things that we're talking about today are. So thank you. I'm very excited to introduce this panel for y'all today of experts. We're going to be talking about how social media and generative AI are going to be intersecting and what it means for our digital online spaces. So to kick us off, I'll be introducing Martina Larkin. Martina is the CEO of Project Liberty. Before that, she was Vice President for Global Issues at System, an AI and data science company. She has spent 16 years at the World Economic Forum, working at the intersection of public policy, economics, and innovation. Next, we have Ravi Iyer. Ravi is the Managing Director of the USC Marshall School Neely Center. Prior to this role, he spent over 4 years leading data science research and product at Meta, working to improve the societal impact of social media. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dalia Hashim. Dalia is the Program and Research Lead for AI and Media Integrity at Partnership on AI. Her career has spanned public policy, research, and community development. Thank you for joining us, everyone. So I think to kick us off, I really want to give folks kind of a picture of where we are right now and what the world is looking like given the rapid deployment of new generative AI systems like ChatGPT and Midjourney. So Dalia, maybe you can start us off. What is different about these new round of tools? How are they different than the engagement maximizing platforms that we've been hearing about, and how are they going to intersect in ways that we might not be aware of yet?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ishuan, for having me. And, it's been quite eye-opening to be here with everyone today and hear all those stories. It's different to talk about the theory and then to hear the actual impact. And so there's something that is very meaningful about that. And I wanted to kind of start by acknowledging that. I think to your question, Camille, there is a continuation of a lot of the algorithmic technologies that we've seen before in the recommender systems that we've talked about, that we've heard a lot about in the previous panel. Those were informed by algorithms. The recommender systems are algorithms that are behind a screen. And I think what generative AI does is it brings a lot of these algorithmic capabilities from behind the screen, from something that happens to us, to something that we can directly interact with. So all of a sudden, we can try out Midjourney for ourselves. We can go on ChatGPT and talk to an algorithm. We can create stuff where it hadn't existed before. And so we have this like one-on-one interfacing ability to be able to create using algorithms, using lots and lots and lots of data points to be able to create something from nothing. And I think that's quite unprecedented. But it follows through from a lot of these previous technologies, and the impact as well follows through from a lot of these previous technologies and abilities that we saw in recommender systems. And so in recommender systems, you've seen, this whole idea of trying to get people to continually engage with the technology by recommending over and over again content that they would be interested in or would likely be influenced by. We saw in 2019 a pretty big uproar against how these recommender systems on YouTube specifically were putting ads on videos that people didn't want ads on. People don't want to be affiliated with certain types of very, very harmful content. And so when that happened, advertisers started pulling out from YouTube. And then all of a sudden, you saw YouTube immediately reacting. They were like, no, we'll improve our algorithms. We'll try out different things. And so I think that like cause and effect is an interesting microcosm to focus on a little bit more when we're talking about what are some of the future potential solutions that we can start looking at when we look at the now much more readily available algorithmic capabilities that we can interface with using, generative AI, ChatGPT, Midjourney, and so many other technologies that are now not just going to exist on separate platforms, but all of a sudden you're going to see them get added to the regular social media platforms that we now use. And so you're going to see a lot of these technologies quickly get combined in the same way that we saw, for example, ChatGPT come out, and then very, quickly right after, Google add, their own version of ChatGPT called Bard, and other, Microsoft, and slowly every single major platform is going to follow through. And so you're going to see a lot of these technologies come together, and there is no time better than now to start figuring out what the solution looks like.
So I'm really worried that generative AI is going to scale a lot of the harms that we've seen online. There are people in the world who hire people to harass others and troll farms. Generative AI is going to make that something that anyone can do. They don't have to pay a lot of people. Anyone can hire their own troll farm. So I think we're going to see a lot of the same harms that we've already experienced scale up in a world of generative AI. I think we've already seen the failures of moderation-based approaches to address some of these harms. I'm not saying moderation doesn't do a lot of important work, but I think Maria Ressa often has this analogy of, if you have a dirty stream and you take a glass and you scoop out some water from it, and you clean that glass of water, and then you dump it back in the stream, and then you wonder, why isn't the stream getting cleaner? Maybe you're going to drink that glass of water, so maybe that's important to actually clean that glass of water. But I think you have to ask the question of what's upstream that's creating that harm? How are these products designed in a way that these harms keep happening? And in a world of generative AI, we're not going to be able to keep up. We're not going to be able to clean those glasses of water one glass at a time, right? And so we're going to have to think about design and how can we design these systems better. So I work at USC's Neely Center now after working at Meta for some time. And one reason I left was to take some of these design solutions that, I'm not saying they're silver bullets, but they have some ability to make some of these things work. Maybe, if privacy was enabled by default, rather than encouraging more connections between people, having more discoverability, then some of these harms would happen less. Maybe if feeds were not optimized for engagement. There's the DSA has made it so that some of the optimization functions for these systems are public now. You can go to Facebook's blog, you can read what they're optimizing for. They will tell you they are optimizing for time spent on video, which means that people get things not that they want, but what they engage with, right? And which is a very big distinction, right? There's lots of things I engage with that I don't want. I'll pay attention to a fight video. I don't want more fight videos in my feed. I want less. But can you catch my attention with something like that? Sure. So, these are all decisions that platforms have made. They are all decisions that platforms can unmake. And there are plenty of design decisions that we could ask companies to make, whether through law or through app stores or through pressure, consumer pressure, through advertisers, that together, we can have a design code for social media.
First of all, I want to say thank you also to all the storytellers. Those stories are really powerful, but also I echo what was being said. Like, when is enough enough? It does feel like we should even change some of the debates here to solutions rather than just repeating some of the harms. And I totally agree with you. AI compounds and makes everything worse, and maybe in certain instances also better in terms of certain areas. But what I think is the big difference that we have to recognize here is that AI is an actor now, not just a tool. These systems are now becoming independent actors that can learn, that can do the things that some humans can do, and that elevates the conversation to a totally different level, and the urgency to solve it, I would say, in the same way. So for me, this is a huge call to action. In a way, the public attention to AI and generative AI is a positive thing because we have everyone's eye on it, but we cannot lose that attention. We have to shift it to solutions and to pragmatic solutions that can happen now, that can happen midterm and maybe in the longer run. And those include policy solutions, but also tech solutions, governance, ethical solutions, a whole series of those, because it's a societal issue, and it shouldn't be solved just by technologists.
Yeah, I think that's right. That takes me to kind of this idea of who is responsible and what can we really expect and from whom. I mean, we've seen just in the last 6 months, Snapchat has launched My AI. It's a chatbot that lives at the top of every user's feed. You have Meta looking to launch essentially a new app that would allow for users to have 30 different personalities. So you have this kind of dynamic of new AI tools being kind of publicly deployed for anyone to use. And that kind of makes me ask, we're in a situation where we have very little guardrails. So who is responsible? Can we, are platforms the ones that should be responsible for this? Can we expect them to be responsible? How do we kind of move towards solutions? Ravi, as someone who worked really hard to do this within a platform, maybe you can kick us off.
So tech companies aren't monoliths. There are people at tech companies who want to do better, who fight to try to make things better. Sorry, honestly, some of the stories really got me. You try to do better, and oftentimes you run into someone at a company who maybe owes a lot of their success, and their identity is tied up with the company. And so I think it's natural. People don't want to believe the thing they built is bad for the world, or that it's caused these harms. And so I think the society needs to play a role to help the companies realize that, look, I don't know how many times I've had people tell me that, what people want is what they engage with, or what people engage with is what they want. And it's somewhat correlated, like, that what I eat is generally what I want, but I will also eat donuts at 4 a.m. when I shouldn't. And it's not what I really want. It's not good for me. And if you deliver donuts for me every day at, 1 a.m, I would not think you're my friend or someone who, has my best interest at heart. So what people engage with is not what they want, but it's easy for people at platforms, for people who are building these products, to believe that some of the things that they build are not as harmful as we who have we don't have those biases. And so that's, I think, society's role, to get them out of short-term thinking, to start thinking longer term about, what is the impact of the product decisions we're making on society. And it's not impossible to get companies to change things. And there are things but they aren't going to do it by themselves. They're not going to do it aggressively enough. They're not going to do it soon enough. And so we definitely have a role in society to push them in that direction.
I think, just to add to that, the lack of action, like the opposite side of that coin, the lack of action inevitably places the onus on the individual, and it places the responsibility on the individual to be able to not just make the right decisions when they're engaging with the media, but now with generative AI, it places the onus on the individual to also figure out what's real from what's not. And I think that's asking quite a bit of every single person, to be able to be in themselves a media verification machine. And so, when we talk about onus, I think if everyone doesn't play their role, and by everyone I mean platforms, I mean governments, I mean civil society organizations, I mean academics, and then us as a society, to Ravi's point, in pressuring that action, what ends up happening is that onus falls on every individual as they engage with that media, to be able to make those decisions, to be able to discern truth from falsehood, to be able to act responsibly when they're engaging with ChatGPT or whatnot. And so I think that now becomes that much more amplified when we now all have tools in our pocket that can generate such powerful and impactful pieces of media, but also can influence the way that we think as individuals and how we see the world around us. One of the things that I think is, to me, especially alarming about some of those, conversational or text-based generative AI tools, is that they give you matter-of-fact answers, right? They provide you ask it, what happened, on X day on Y year, right? And it will give you a very matter-of-fact answer 9 times out of 10. And so that shapes how we see the world, because if someone asserts to you that this is what happened, then that's how you see the world from there onwards. And so I think that that's a very important thing to also consider when we talk about who is or who is responsible. I think ultimately, all of these different players need to come together for a solution.
Yeah, I second that. But I would say also, while regulation is obviously important and policy is important because it creates the guardrails around things. So there's, the right to reveal or the right to review the data and where it's coming from. We should also look at the actual business models of these big platforms and how they operate and what is at the source of that. And it's very much the data, our data, all of our data. And all the stories we've heard were also related to that story and manipulation and how that is going to get worse. We've just heard it through AI. And so how about thinking differently about how we deal with data privacy and data itself and developing systems where we own our own data rather than 2 or 3 big platforms? I mean, it seems absurd that we have 2 or 3 of these platforms which do not have the right intentions, that own all of our data and don't know where it is stored, don't know what's happening with it, don't know how this is being applied or learned or potentially used. So I would also argue that the sort of disruption of the systems that we have right now is a critical element in addition to all the things that we said about society and regulation.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about at the last panel too. It's this idea of the profit motive, the business model, and how do you shift that? How do you make it so that being safer is incentivized and so that being and building responsibility and safety by design is cheaper than it is to be completely irresponsible? And we've talked about the role of civil society, the role of platforms, but what about the role of policymakers? I mean, what advice do you guys have? This is probably one of the first times we've had Congress so engaged on an issue. Thankfully, because of the work that so many people here have done on social media, they're so aware that harms are going to be amplified. So they're deeply engaged. They want to do something. What advice would each of you give to these policymakers to make sure that they're targeting the business model and that whatever kind of thing that they're designing, whatever regulatory framework they look at, is also future proof? Because we're just going to see technology come out in bigger, more difficult, more complex, with bigger harms. Anyone?
Well, I mean, we have analogous situations, right? People could build really cheap buildings, but we have building codes that stop them from building buildings out of asbestos and flammable materials. And similarly, at USC, we have a design code for social media that's based on a lot of things that we've seen work in some situations. And they contain very simple things like privacy defaults, like rate limits. Oftentimes it's a very small group of people who are doing a lot of bad things. If you just stop the people from being able to contact thousands of other people or look at the profiles of thousands of other people, like just having sensible rate limits or even asking platforms, like, what are your rate limits? Like, how many people can people contact? So rate limits, privacy defaults, not optimizing for engagement. There are simple things that people can do to design systems to be safer. And I think in legislation, we don't want to tell, I think free speech is important. We don't want to, I don't think platforms are responsible for every bad thing that happens online, but I do think they are responsible if they design a space that encourages bad things to happen. And I think there are ways that, just like, if something bad happens in this building, if I trip and fall, I'm not going to sue the builder. But if they built some, thing in the floor that made me fall, then yeah, like I think they're responsible. If they make the building out of some flammable material, I think we're increasingly understanding that some of these products are built in ways that are unsafe, and therefore we should unmake some of those decisions. And to make it future-proof, a lot of the reason why I can say that with some conviction is because platforms do these A/B tests, and they have one version of the product versus another version of the product, and they can see what's the effect of this version of the product on reports of bullying or on experiences of graphic content. And so there is data that we can ask for to understand, not just for social media platforms, but also for the companies building AI systems, about what is the experimental effect of designing your product in one way versus designing your product in another way. And so if we understand that data, that is that is what causality means for scientists, right? Like experimentally, what does one version of your product cause in a group of people? We need to get that data if we want to be meaningful partners in designing these systems to be better.
I think to add to that, um, our approach to policy in general needs to shift a little bit. I think we want policy to be a one and done solution 9 times out of 10 when we're approaching some of these technological questions. And I think that that needs to change into iterative solutioning that bakes into the policy making abilities for us to amend and to shift and to expand the policies depending on the changes that we see in the technologies that are being developed. I think the policy needs to meet the moment when it comes to the technological development and the speed at which it is changing. And so that involves first establishing certain principles of how are we approaching these technologies in general? What are our areas that are like no-go? You know, like these are areas that we have all agreed technology should not be, you know, implemented in or used for. And then what principles are we going to approach the rest of the policymaking through? And then leave space in the policies themselves to be able to be iterative, to Ravi's point, to be able to be tested. I think all of those, you know, opportunities are really important for policy to be able to meet the moment. And just to give you an example, you know, at Partnership on AI for the last year and a half, Claire, who's not here today, but who is my manager and is also on my team, has worked very hard on developing the synthetic media framework. And it was prior to ChatGPT, but we kind of saw the writing on the wall that these are kind of some of the technologies that are coming. And she put together a multi-stakeholder steering committee. And she was like, hey, this is an issue that we're going to face. How do we begin finding solutions for it? And through lots of conversations, they discovered that solutioning needs to address every part of how people interact with generative AI. And so they said, you know, the platforms need to be addressed, how generative AI is being platformed, how companies that create generative AI put guardrails around the ability to create such technologies, and then how creators who use generative AI use that technology to be able to create products using Gen AI. And so the framework addressed all three of those actors and applied understandings of what disclosure and transparency ought to look like for all three of those actors. And then we said, we're publishing this, but this is not the end of the road. We're going to work with all of our partners who agree to use the synthetic media framework to collect use cases on a yearly basis from them to say, hey, how have you used this framework? How has it worked for you? How has it failed you? And how can we change the framework based on that to be able to meet some of those downsides of the framework or where it was limited in its application to be able to continue to improve it? And so I think that's kind of just a smaller example of how policy can kind of, or our policy approach needs to change as these technologies change as well.
I would just add something. I mean, I think there's lots of ideas, but I think the sort of great challenge will be how do we not only protect human rights, but also build human agency? And I think a lot of the stories reflect that we have lost that sort of agency over technology, and that when you think about technology and society, the balance is completely out of sync. And I think we need to think about the world we want to see and want to see for our children rather than just mitigating a risk against risks here or there. I think that sort of seems to be a losing approach to me, especially in the age of generative AI and whatever comes next, because there will be another technology, whether it's quantum computing or whatever you have. So having that, you know, longer term view, and then certainly from a process perspective, a more agile, iterative approach, the EU, and I would say one that has teeth, because right now in the US, it doesn't have any teeth. The approach here doesn't have any teeth. The EU is trying to set up some policies with teeth, and you know, we'll see how effective that will be, but it certainly has more potential than just, you know, voluntary contributions of these big platforms, which I think we have all seen have not necessarily done the right things in the past.
Yeah, I think that, so that takes me very nicely to our final question before audience questions. Martina, you mentioned the EU, you mentioned that they're looking at teeth. Any other lessons for us here from the regulatory frameworks, either in the EU or elsewhere across the world, one or two just quick things that policymakers can take that are going to be very impactful?
Well, I think the building of these ethical principles into the technology and demanding it and having that design approach, as we have asked for with social media, critical. Trusted international institutions, like there's been talk about an IPPC for data and data privacy and how that is done. I think that is super important when we now see what's happening, and also in the Middle East, and we have no longer trusted institutions where we can really turn to. So what would that look like is a sort of an add-on in terms of what I think we need to look at, the holistic framework for solutions.
I'm really grateful for the EU for the leading in legislation. I do think there are things we can learn to do better. And I think, every law you learn things and understand like what you could do better. I think some of the requirements are somewhat vague. And so one reason I focus on like, get the experimental data from the platform about exactly what the effect is on bullying and harassment is because I think when you give people vague transparency requirements, like you will do a risk assessment, it's just too slippery. Like it's easy for that not to have an impact. So I think being less vague. The other thing I think is leaning into design versus moderation. There are things in there about like codes of practice for misinformation. It's only a tiny amount of content that will ever get fact checked and thought of as misinformation. When you talk to publishers, they will tell you that they have this incentive to, the New York Times even feels this incentive, right? To sensationalize things, to mislead people at times, right? And so in that world, the tiny bit of content that gets fact checked as misinformation is not where you want to focus. Sure, there's important things to do for fact checking, but like focusing on like these like classes of content like that are illegal. I think you need to think wider about the broader user experience you're creating. And so yeah, being not focusing on moderation and being less vague about your transparency requirements, those are two things I think we should all strive for in our next set of laws.
I don't have much to add, to be honest. I think that as a Canadian, I think the only thing I would bring to the table is the Canadian experience of trying to implement some of those lessons from the EU. And I think one of the biggest ones is seeing the AI and Data Act in Canada, which is currently under consultation. And the Canadian government, once they put it out for consultation, I think they thought it was very all-encompassing in its application. And they were very surprised through the consultation process at how many companies, private actors, civil society organizations gave them very meaningful feedback about, and you can't have one act that does everything at the same time. And so they're currently back at the drawing board, I presume, given kind of the level of feedback that they got. And so this, consultation approach is really important for some of those regulatory approaches.
Yeah, thank you all. We can open it up to any audience questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kayla Brochu. I teach at George Washington here and have been in this sector as a prosecutor of online child exploitation and human trafficking, and then as a civil litigator for about 20 years. So I've watched the evolution of this and also watched what's happened, not just with social media, but other forms of online harm. And what I have observed is that there are often organizations, maybe not the bigger ones, that want to do good, but they can't. They can't because we have the unfortunate reality that what sells is online engagement. And we don't have our psychology expert here anymore or up at the stage anymore, but he would tell us that when our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism is triggered, that causes us to engage, right? So that is their business model. And if any one company were to drop that, then they would be at a competitive disadvantage. As somebody who routinely sues social media companies for child online abuse, that is something that sells. They will not even take down that material, even though we have a carve out under Section 230. We have to sue them every single time. So what I've learned from that is that, and I worked on the original Ruby principles on business and human rights about a little over a decade ago. I have an MBA and thought, okay, I'm done with being a lawyer and fighting. Now I want to solve. What I learned from that is that individual good companies, if even if they're or actors within companies can't, because they're at a competitive disadvantage in this sector. I also think that smart regulation, I really like Dalia's suggestion about like the iterative approach, like creating a body that is actually knowledgeable about this, not necessarily our, as we call geriatric Congress necessarily, or certainly our geriatric parts of Congress. But it is because I'm thinking about, for example, Apple, and there has been a large controversy, as probably most of you know, about whether or not they're going to test hashtags. They're going to find the identifiable child sex abuse material in their cloud. And what they are, and I actually believe they're genuinely worried about, truthfully, is that they are worried what happens when they go to China. Now, I could say to them, you can't afford to go to China because the cost on our children is too high. But the other thing that regulation can do is limit their ability, is mandate their ability or their requirement to share the child sex abuse material, but limit their ability to provide other information so that they have a way of negotiating with other places that say, I wish I could, but I can't. And those are the ways that we can think constructively about working with the social media companies and helping them recognize that regulation can actually help them. Nobody wants to go down in history as a company. I mean, they might not realize it, but nobody wants to go down in history as the company that was ruining generations of young people. I hope, I don't think.
I think that I'll open it up to anyone who wants to comment, but I think that we agree that the incentive structure needs to change for the way that, you know, our entire economy works around most things, including tech platforms. But
And the way that the incentive structure changes so that, you know, I can't undercut somebody else in building your house is we have standards, right? That don't allow people to undercut other people with cheaper products or less safe products, right? So I think there's something to be said for standards, just like we have for cars and buildings for social media.
I think the only thing I would add is you'd be surprised how many companies are willing to come around the table if you bring all of them around the table, to your point, versus if you focus on one at a time. I think collective action is powerful, and I think the government is especially well positioned for collective action.
I maybe have a more controversial view on this, but I'm not sure that we can really get at least the big platforms to sort of change and do the right things. If you look at the history of how they've even changed their own policies and how they anticipate already the regulation that's coming their way. So I would advocate for a much more radical change, and one that also, as I said earlier, involves us owning and controlling the data that we give away, our personal data that I personally don't think should be in the hands of Meta or any of these big platforms.
I think, do we have time for one more quick question? Is there one more quick question? No? Okay. Oh, yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Archit. I'm a Tech and Public Policy Fellow at the Beyond the Screen. And my question is for Ravi. You mentioned that content regulation is not the approach you prefer. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, so good work is done by content moderators, but the policies are narrow. There are so many more ways to create hate than any hate speech policy would ever encapsulate. For example, there's a professor, Karam Garmella, who does work, looks for hate speech in India, often finds what he calls fear speech, which doesn't violate policies, which is basically, if you want to create hate, take a crime committed by someone of that group and just publicize it, right? You don't have to mention the group they're from. And oftentimes in many places, this kind of content can lead to attitudes. It's people do that with immigrants in the United States. People of all groups commit crimes, right? It's easy to just cherry pick a few groups, talk about their crimes in particular, and you don't have to violate a hate speech policy to create hate. So you don't have to violate a misinformation policy or you don't have to lie to people to mislead them either. So I think content moderation has a place. It's important, but it's only going to address a narrow slice of content. When you try and expand that set of content that you had applied to, you often get censorship. You often act, you start using a tool that wasn't meant for, you change your policy to conform to an emergency, and you end up taking down, someone's important, one of the most popular forms of hate speech in the world is, people saying like men are scum, which is not, it's just, it's a phrase that people say. Many people, again, according to some versions of policy, it's been, but yes, there are many versions of, when you look at a random sample of hate speech, a lot of it will be benign, will be things that people don't actually consider to be hateful.
Hello. Ravi, firstly, I'd like to point out that calling men scum is not hate speech because there are defined workings around it. And if I have time for question, may I ask, or do I have time for a question?
I think why don't you guys take it during the break? Is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, everyone.